Settle in with a cup of tea and your imagination. This is Detective Duo, where every clue finds its place, just as Tommy and Tuppence would have insisted. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us where in the world you're joining from. It began with the sort of English sunshine that always felt slightly suspicious, too polite, too temporary. Meadowbrook Green had put on its very best manners for the vicar's annual picnic, tables lined with tartan cloths, sponge cakes obediently resisting the breeze, and a brass band from the next parish playing with the enthusiasm of men who had lunched too well. Tuppence Beresford adjusted her straw hat and eyed the teapot that refused to pour without dribbling. "If civilization collapses, Tommy," she said, "I shall blame it on teapots and clergy." Her husband, lying back on one elbow, grinned at her through the rim of his cup. A dangerous combination, but we seem to have survived both so far. Around them, the village of Meadowbrook performed its summer pantomime, mothers corralling jam-stained toddlers, the vicar's wife fluttering like bunting from one table to another, and the postman, a cheerful, pink-faced fellow named Miller, handing out strawberries as though he delivered them by appointment. Nothing in the scene at first glance suggested mystery or menace. Then the boy began to speak. He stood apart from the other children, small and thin, his knees grass-stained, his expression distant as though he were listening to something no one else could hear. In his hands was a school notebook splattered with blue ink. Without preamble, he began to recite in a sing-song voice, clear enough to rise above the gramophone's wobbly foxtrot. "The letter that burned but never was sent, the man by the river who came and went, the clock that stopped when the bell struck 2, the one who knows is watching you." A small silence rippled through the nearest picnic rug. Someone laughed uncertainly. The vicar's wife clapped her hands and said, "Oh, what a clever rhyme, Henry." But even she looked relieved when the gramophone blared back into life. Tuppence, however, felt the faint prickle that experience had taught her never to ignore. She had heard riddles before, from criminals, diplomats, and occasionally Tommy, but rarely from a child whose eyes seemed older than his voice. She strolled over as the crowd's attention drifted to lemonade. "That was quite a performance, Henry," she said lightly. "Did you make it up yourself?" The boy looked up. "I just write what I hear." "From whom?" He frowned. "It doesn't like names." Before Tuppence could pursue this unsettling answer, a shout came from near the riverbank. Several people began to run. Tommy, instantly alert, was already halfway there. She followed, lifting her skirt clear of the grass. Postman Miller lay sprawled beside the water, his straw hat bobbing in the reeds. 2 men knelt beside him. "Heat stroke," someone muttered. "He's been out in the sun too long." Tommy felt for a pulse and shook his head. "No use," he said quietly. "He's gone." The vicar's wife pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. "Oh, dear Lord, he was perfectly well a moment ago." While the crowd murmured its disbelief, Tuppence's eye caught a detail others missed. A streak of vivid blue across Miller's sleeve, like a child's careless brushstroke. A moment later she noticed the notebook lying a few feet away where Henry had been sitting. Its cover bore the same smear. "Tommy," she said softly, "look." He followed her gaze. "Ink," he murmured, "unless the post office has changed its uniform regulations." Henry stood at the edge of the ring of adults, silent, hugging his knees. When Tuppence approached, he whispered, "He shouldn't have touched the letter. I told him not to." "Which letter, Henry?" But the boy only shook his head. By the time the constable from the next village arrived, a young man more accustomed to stray chickens than sudden death, the sun had lost its cheer. The body was carried to the vicarage, the guests dispersed with subdued chatter, and the band packed away its instruments in embarrassed haste. Tommy and Tuppence lingered by the river. A dragonfly darted through the air, its wings flashing like glass. "Well?" Tommy asked. "Any theories, my Watson?" "2," said Tuppence. "Either Henry writes prophetic verse or he's repeating something he's overheard. And whichever it is, that rhyme about the man by the river was a little too prompt, don't you think?" Tommy skimmed a pebble across the water. "A coincidence, perhaps." She gave him a look. "My dear, if I ever believe in coincidence, you may call for the doctor." They walked back toward the lane where the Beresfords had parked their modest motor car. The road shimmered with heat, the hedges buzzing with indolent bees. Yet beneath the hum of summer, the village seemed to have slipped into a different key, a faint discord, like a note held too long. At the vicarage gate they met the vicar's wife, still pale. "The doctor says it was the heart," she said quickly, as though speed might make it true. Poor Mr. Miller had been complaining of palpitations. Such a shock for the children, especially little Henry. He was so fond of him. "Indeed," Tuppence said gently. "Might we call on the Larch family tomorrow, just to bring the boy a sweet or two?" The woman hesitated, then nodded. "I suppose that would be kind." When they reached home that evening, a comfortable room at the inn overlooking the square, Tuppence spread the events on the table as neatly as playing cards. "Fact 1, she said, ticking them off. "Henry's riddle mentions a letter. Fact 2, the vicar's wife keeps the parish correspondence in her writing desk. Fact 3, our late postman had blue ink on his sleeve identical to Henry's. Ergo, you suspect an epistolary conspiracy," Tommy finished with a grin, "possibly involving envelopes of a sinister hue. Laugh if you like, but I'd wager something went missing today besides a sponge cake." Tommy poured them each a glass of lemonade. The inn was strictly temperance, and leaned back. "You know, Tuppence, most couples collect postcards from their holidays. We seem to collect corpses." She smiled faintly. "Cheaper than souvenirs, and far more stimulating." He studied her face. "You're serious about the boy?" "I'm serious about the ink, and about the way he said it doesn't like names. Children don't talk like that unless they've been frightened into poetry." Outside, the clock on the village hall struck 9. Somewhere a door slammed. A dog barked once and was silent. The sound of the world settling down for the night made their conversation feel almost unreal. Tommy rose, hands in pockets. "All right. Tomorrow we'll pay a call on the Larch household. I'll make polite noises to the father, you can charm the mother, and between us perhaps we'll coax another riddle or two from Master Henry." Tuppence gathered the notebook she had retrieved from the grass. Its owner would not miss it till morning. On the last page, written in a child's uneven hand, was another verse. 3 go walking, 1 comes back. Look for the sign the river lacks. The letter sleeps where the shadows creep. The ink is blue, the promise deep. She felt the faintest chill, though the evening was still warm. "Tommy," she said, "I have a feeling our picnic isn't quite over." He took the notebook, read the lines, and sighed. "Then we'd better pack another basket," he said, "this time with sandwiches and common sense." But as they turned out the lamp, the blue ink gleamed faintly in the light, like something that remembered too much. The little sitting room of the Meadowbrook guest house carried that faint odour peculiar to rented accommodation, a blend of lavender polish and forgotten cigars. Morning sunlight slanted through lace curtains, catching on a teacup that Tuppence had not yet touched. She sat at the small table with Henry Larch's notebook spread before her, the blue-inked pages like tiny bruises on paper. Tommy, fresh from his shave and exuding a faint whiff of bay rum, leaned against the mantel. "I suppose," he said, "it's too much to hope that our poetic prodigy merely has an overactive imagination." Tuppence looked up. "A child who rhymes about death beside a river, and then watches it happen. No, Tommy, imagination isn't that punctual." He came over to peer at the notebook. "Still, the question remains, where does he get his material? The letter that burned but never sent, that's pure melodrama." "Or memory," Tuppence replied. "Yesterday, when we left the vicarage, I saw smoke from their kitchen chimney, and Mrs. Larch was at the window. The boy might have seen something burned." Tommy frowned thoughtfully. And if something was burned, someone wanted it gone. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock, a brisk, practical sound that only a woman of authority could produce. Mrs. Greaves, the guest-house landlady, entered without waiting for permission. Her apron looked starched enough to deflect bullets. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Beresford, but there's been a bit of upset at the vicarage this morning," she said. "Mrs. Wilmot sent word round that a church envelope's gone missing, the one with the offertory money for the orphan fund. She's beside herself." Tuppence exchanged a look with Tommy. "An envelope," she murmured. "How convenient." "Do they suspect anyone?" Tommy asked. "Not that I've heard, but Mrs. Wilmot's in tears. She says she must have left it in her desk drawer." When Mrs. Greaves left, Tuppence closed the notebook with a snap. "There you are. Henry's verse about a letter that burned but never sent fits neatly, doesn't it? Something that should have been delivered but wasn't. A letter, or an envelope." Tommy lifted an eyebrow. So our next stop is the vicarage. The vicarage was a cheerful-looking house with ivy that clung as though it believed in redemption. They found Mrs. Wilmot in the study, wringing her lace handkerchief and talking at a remarkable speed. "Oh, it's dreadful, simply dreadful," she exclaimed. "The envelope was on my desk last evening, quite safe. When I came in this morning to write to the treasurer, gone. The key's always in the drawer, of course, but one doesn't expect—" "Of course not," said Tuppence soothingly. "You haven't noticed any strangers about?" Mrs. Wilmot shook her head, curls bobbing. "Only the Larch boy, playing in the garden yesterday. He's such a dear child, though a little odd." "Odd in what way?" Tommy asked. The vicar's wife hesitated. "He listens. You know how children chatter? Henry doesn't. He listens, terribly hard, as if he's trying to remember every word." Tuppence glanced toward the window. Through the lace curtain, she could see the boy himself in the garden, crouched by the fish pond, drawing patterns on the stone with a stick. "Would you mind," she asked, "if we had a word with his parents? For reassurance's sake, of course." Mrs. Wilmot seemed relieved to delegate worry. "By all means. They live in the little row by the mill road, number 4. His father's a clerk at Mr. Finley's accounting office in town. A good man, very quiet." Number 4 Mill Road looked as though it had been built for tidiness and then left to sag gently under the weight of years. Tuppence noticed the small garden where flowers had attempted, bravely, to bloom amid nettles. She knocked, and after a moment the door opened a cautious 6 inches. Albert Larch was a man whose entire being seemed to apologize for existing. His shoulders stooped, his spectacles perched on the edge of his nose, and his fingers fiddled with the latch even as he greeted them. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford?" Yes, Henry mentioned you. Please, come in." The sitting room was cramped but clean, filled with the faint scent of liniment. On the mantel stood a photograph of a young woman smiling, and beside it, a cup half filled with cold tea. "My wife isn't well enough to come down," he said, catching their glance. "She has a weak heart. The doctor says rest." "I'm sorry to hear that," said Tuppence kindly. "Your boy's been quite the talk of the village. His poems are remarkable." Albert gave a nervous laugh. "Oh, that. Henry's a fanciful child, too much imagination. He listens to stories on the wireless and repeats them all wrong." "Still," Tommy said casually, "some of the things he says seem rather specific. For instance, the one about a letter that burned." The man's hand froze halfway to his glasses. "A letter?" Tuppence caught the flicker of alarm before he recovered. "Only a line he recited at the picnic," she said lightly. "It struck us as curious." Albert turned away, pretending to straighten the photograph. "You know how children are. They pick things up." "And sometimes drop them," Tommy added, watching him. The door creaked upstairs and a faint voice called, "Albert, who is it?" He hurried to the stair. "Just visitors, dear. Nothing important." Then to them, "If you'll excuse me, my wife tires easily." As he went up, Tuppence moved quietly to the writing desk in the corner. A blotter lay open, and beneath it she saw a scrap of charred paper. Only one word remained legible: fund. She tucked it neatly back. "Tommy," she whispered, "I think our letter that burned has made an appearance." Before Tommy could reply, Henry appeared in the doorway, solemn as a ghost. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "It makes it worse." "What does, Henry?" "The waiting," he whispered. "It's when people talk that it listens hardest." The tone sent a faint chill even down Tommy's practical spine. "Who listens, old chap?" But the boy only shook his head and slipped away. Back outside, the afternoon had softened into gold. Tuppence took a deep breath. "That man is frightened," she said. Tommy nodded. "Of us, of something, or of himself. Hard to say which." "And the burned scrap? That proves there was a letter, probably the missing envelope." They walked slowly toward the main street, their thoughts pacing beside them. "Let's say," Tommy mused, "that Albert Larch had access to the vicarage. Perhaps he helped with the accounts, saw where the envelope was kept. He takes it, regrets it, burns part of it. But where does the boy come in?" Tuppence's eyes softened. "He hears too much. Children do. He repeats it as riddles because that's the only language adults don't punish him for using." They reached the guest house where Mrs. Greaves was hanging laundry. "A letter for you, Mr. Beresford," she called, handing him a plain envelope. Tommy opened it idly, and both froze. Inside was a single sheet, written in the same uneven blue ink as Henry's notebook. "Stop asking what the child knows." No signature, no address. Tuppence looked up sharply. "Delivered by post?" Mrs. Greaves shook her head. "No, dear. Found it pushed under the door not half an hour ago." Tommy turned the paper over. "Well," he said cheerfully, though his eyes had darkened, "someone's listening at any rate." Tuppence placed the new letter beside Henry's notebook, its blue ink unmistakably the same hand. "Tommy," she murmured, "we've just been invited to stay for a longer holiday." The smell of chicken broth filled the hallway of No. 4 Mill Road long before Tuppence knocked. She carried the small covered pot carefully in both hands, as though bearing not soup but diplomacy. On such errands she believed firmly that no truth was ever coaxed from a household without the promise of something warm and edible. When Albert Larch opened the door, his eyes flickered from the pot to her face with the resignation of a man besieged by kindness. "Mrs. Beresford," he said, attempting a smile, "you shouldn't have troubled yourself." "I never trouble myself," said Tuppence, breezing past him with the confidence of a woman who had long ago decided that social hesitations were for less curious souls. "I trouble others. Where may I put this?" He led her into the sitting room, which was so tidy it felt airless. A clock ticked too loudly, curtains drawn just enough to muffle the day. On the mantel that same photograph of a smiling younger Mrs. Larch had been joined by a half-wilted vase of wildflowers, a hopeful gesture that had already given up. "Your wife?" Tuppence asked gently. He nodded. "Upstairs. She's resting." "Then I'll just have a word with her, while the soup's still hot. Broth loses its courage if one waits too long." He hesitated. "She tires easily." "So do I," Tuppence replied cheerfully, already on the stair. Mrs. Larch lay in a small, square bedroom that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and lavender water. The windows were shut tight despite the mildness of the morning. She was pale, bird-like, but her eyes were sharp. "Mrs. Beresford," she murmured. "How kind." Tuppence set down the tray and began ladling soup into a bowl. "Kindness and curiosity," she said lightly. "They're close relations. I thought you might enjoy company. Henry spoke of you at the picnic." The woman's thin hand twitched on the coverlet. "He shouldn't talk so much." "Oh, he talks most delightfully," said Tuppence, "though his rhymes are rather haunting. He must get that from someone." Mrs. Larch gave a short, nervous laugh. "He hears things. You know how children are, always listening at doors." "Yes," Tuppence said softly, "and sometimes to things they shouldn't." She glanced around the room, a neat dressing table, a stack of books, and on the writing desk by the window, several unopened letters tied with a blue ribbon. "Do you have many correspondents?" she asked in a tone too mild to sound prying. "Just old friends," said Mrs. Larch quickly. "People from before." "Before what?" Mrs. Larch's fingers tightened on the blanket. "Before Albert changed positions. He works late now, at the Hall, accounting work for Mr. Finley's estate. Very respectable." Tuppence stirred the soup absently. "Ah, yes, the Hall. And is it well lit at night?" The question startled her hostess. Why do you ask?" Tuppence smiled. "I dislike dim workplaces. Ink blots, you know." There was a pause. The clock on the mantel struck 11, a hollow sound in the airless room. Mrs. Larch seemed to shrink a little into her pillows. "Henry shouldn't be writing those verses," she said suddenly. "It upsets Albert. You mustn't encourage him." "I only listen," said Tuppence, "and I think Henry needs to be listened to." A faint colour rose in the woman's cheeks. "He's a good boy, but sometimes he seems to know things we haven't spoken of." Tuppence touched her arm lightly. "If he's frightened, perhaps speaking will help." Mrs. Larch looked away. "There's nothing to speak of." Tuppence knew a wall when she met one. She rose, adjusting her hat. "Then I'll let you rest. The soup should last you till evening, unless Albert eats first." At the door, Mrs. Larch said quietly, "Please don't come again. Not about this." Tuppence turned. "About what, my dear?" But the woman only closed her eyes. Outside, the fresh air felt almost shocking. Tuppence took a deep breath and was immediately intercepted by a tall, angular woman carrying a basket of apples. "Good morning, Mrs. Beresford," said Miss Peveril, the schoolmistress, in the careful tone of one who habitually corrected the world's grammar. "Visiting the Larches, are you? I shouldn't wonder if they were ill again." "Mrs. Larch isn't strong," Tuppence said diplomatically. "She never has been," Miss Peveril sniffed. "And that boy, Henry, isn't right either. Bright, but odd, speaks in other people's voices." Tuppence's eyes sharpened. "Other people's voices?" "Oh, yes," said the woman, clearly pleased to have an audience. "Last term he stood up in class and said, 'Clear as day, the man in the cellar is cold.' Frightened the life out of me. When I asked what he meant, he just stared and said he didn't know. Children can be uncanny." Tuppence tilted her head. Perhaps he overheard something. Miss Peveril gave a humourless laugh. "What, in that little house? I doubt they've a cellar at all." "But the hall does," said Tuppence thoughtfully. Miss Peveril's eyes brightened with mischief. "Ah, the hall. Well, if gossip's to be believed, not all its treasures are kept in the accounts. Some say Mr. Finley's been creative with the parish funds, and that clerk of his, Albert Larch, knows more than he lets on." "Gossip," said Tuppence pleasantly, "is an underrated form of research." The schoolmistress leaned in. "If you're looking for mischief, Mrs. Beresford, you'll find it behind respectable curtains. That's where it lives." That evening, over tea and seed cake at the guest house, Tuppence relayed her discoveries. Tommy listened with his usual mixture of amusement and calculation. "So, the good Mrs. Larch keeps a bundle of unread letters tied with ribbon," he said, "and her husband works late at a place with a cellar, and our poetic prodigy speaks in riddles about letters, rivers, and men underground. You do pick delightful company, my dear." "Add to that," Tuppence said, "the fact that Mrs. Larch nearly fainted when I mentioned ink. There's something more than nerves in that house." Tommy poured her another cup. "And I've something to add myself. I called on the parish bank today under pretext of paying our bill. The missing church funds, that envelope Mrs. Wilmot lost, never arrived. It was never deposited." Tuppence's eyes widened. "So the envelope vanished between desk and bank." "Precisely. And the only man who might have handled it unofficially is Albert Larch. He does occasional accounts for the vicar." She sat back, thoughtful. "If he took it, he's desperate, but I don't think greed fits him. Fear does. He's frightened, perhaps, of whoever's behind those riddles." Tommy nodded slowly. "Suppose the hall isn't just where he works late, but where he's being made to work late, under pressure." Tuppence leaned forward. "Then Henry's rhymes are his father's confessions in disguise, a child's code for an adult's secret." For a moment they were silent, the only sound the gentle clink of china. Outside, the lamplighter's steps echoed down the lane, steady as a metronome. "Tommy," she said finally, "I think we ought to visit the hall." "Splendid," he said dryly. "Shall I bring flowers or a flashlight?" "Both," said Tuppence, "one for the master, the other for the cellar." Evening in Meadowbrook arrived like a held breath, slow, suspended, with every sound slightly too clear. The church bell had not yet struck 6 when Tommy Beresford, walking back from the vicarage, noticed a small figure sitting on the stone wall by the churchyard. Henry Larch. The boy was alone, legs dangling, his eyes fixed upward toward the bell tower where pigeons wheeled lazily in the light. Tommy slowed. "Evening, old chap," he called, admiring the view. Henry didn't turn, his voice drifted out, soft and sing-song. "The one who climbs will never come down, the rope will whisper, the bell will frown." Tommy felt a shiver of genuine unease. "That's a cheery verse," he said lightly, coming closer. "You're writing another masterpiece for us?" The boy looked at him then, his expression distant. "It's not mine," he said. "It's what the tower says." "Does it indeed?" Tommy asked. "Well, perhaps it'll tell me what you've been doing here after tea time." Henry shook his head, clutching something in his hand, a scrap of paper, folded and creased. "It told me to watch," he said, and then, with sudden energy, he jumped down from the wall and ran off down the path, vanishing behind the lich gate before Tommy could call him back. For a long moment, Tommy stood still, staring after the boy. Then his gaze returned to the tower. The sunset had caught the narrow windows, turning them into slits of molten gold. The rope of the bell could just be seen through the archway, swaying slightly in the still air. "Well," he muttered, "since the invitation's open." The climb up the narrow staircase was steep and close, the air smelling of dust and bird feathers. His torch beam caught bits of plaster, old rope, and a few cobwebs that looked capable of trapping small mammals. Somewhere above, a pigeon flapped indignantly. About halfway up, he found a crisp footprint in the dust, too large to be a child's and no more than hours old. He crouched, touching it. Fresh. The edge was still crisp. Tommy's instincts sharpened. He climbed faster. At the top landing, where the great bell hung silent in its frame, he found what he hadn't expected, a canvas satchel tucked behind a beam. The buckle was half broken, and the flap hung open to reveal a mess of torn papers, brittle with age. He pulled one out carefully, a ledger page, headed Finley Estate Accounts, private. The figures were smeared, the ink faded, but one phrase leapt clear in the margin, transferred without record. Tommy whistled softly. So our Clark friend has been doing arithmetic off the books. He dug further. There, caught between the papers, was a small length of blue ribbon, frayed and faintly scented with lavender, the same ribbon Tuppence had seen binding Mrs. Larch's unopened letters. "Well, my boy Henry," Tommy murmured, "you do have an eye for prophecies." He was about to replace the satchel when a faint sound from below froze him. Footsteps, light but deliberate, echoing on the stairs. Someone was coming up. Tommy switched off his torch and pressed himself against the cold stone, breath held. The steps reached the landing and paused. In the gloom, a silhouette hesitated, then turned slightly, just enough for Tommy to glimpse a glint of metal in the fading light. Not a weapon, perhaps, a pocket watch or a clasp. The figure lingered for a moment longer, then turned and descended again, footsteps fading. Only when he heard the creak of the outer door did Tommy move. He let out a slow breath. "Too many ghosts in this village for comfort," he muttered, and started down. Outside, the churchyard was empty. The gate hung ajar. A thin mist had begun to gather in the hollows of the grass, and from somewhere beyond the wall came the steady crunch of retreating feet on gravel. Tommy didn't follow. It wasn't the night for heroics. Back at the guest house, Tuppence was arranging a small triumph of domesticity. Teapot, 2 cups, and a plate of seed cake. She looked up as Tommy entered. "Late, darling. I was beginning to imagine you eloped with Mrs. Wilmot's jam sponge." "Nearly," said Tommy, sinking into a chair. "Only the lady turned out to be a bell tower." "Ah," said Tuppence, "you've been courting architecture again. Did it whisper sweet nothings?" He told her, succinctly but vividly, about Henry, the verse, the climb, the satchel, and the shadowed visitor. When he produced the torn ledger page and the ribbon, her eyes lit with grim satisfaction. "Blue ribbon indeed. Mrs. Larch ties all her secrets in lavender. This connects her straight to the missing funds." "Or," Tommy said, "to whoever planted the satchel to make it look that way. Don't forget our nocturnal friend with the shiny accessory." Tuppence leaned back, tapping a finger against her chin. "So someone else knew about the ledger. Perhaps wanted it found, perhaps not. Either way, our quiet little village is developing more layers than a wedding cake." Before Tommy could answer, a faint sound interrupted, a soft rustle near the door, followed by the scrape of paper on wood. Tuppence was on her feet instantly. She crossed the room and picked up a folded note lying on the floor, pushed halfway under the door. She opened it, her expression tightening. "Stop asking what the child knows. Last warning." The same uneven hand, the same cheap paper. No signature. Tommy reached for it. "Delivered by hand again," he said. "We're getting quite the fan club." "Fan clubs don't usually issue threats," Tuppence said sharply. "Someone's afraid Henry will talk, or rhyme, too much." He studied her face. "You're thinking of the boy?" "Yes. He's a frightened messenger in a play he doesn't understand. We need to reach him before whoever's writing these notes does." Tommy leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Then tomorrow we start at the hall. That ledger page didn't climb a tower on its own." Tuppence nodded. "And I'll have another word with Mrs. Larch. She may not speak, but her ribbon already has." Later that night, when the house was quiet and the last guest's footsteps had faded down the corridor, Tuppence lay awake listening to the occasional sigh of the wind through the shutters. It wasn't fear that kept her wakeful, but thought, lines connecting in her mind like threads on an invisible web. She rose and went to the small writing table, lighting the lamp. Beside the notebook of Henry's verses, she laid the new note, the blue ribbon, and the torn ledger page. In the lamplight, They seemed part of the same handwriting, the same story half told. She traced her finger over Henry's words from the earlier rhyme. The one who climbs will never come down. Not a prophecy, she murmured to herself. A memory. Someone climbed that tower before and didn't return. The thought chilled her. She closed the notebook gently, turning off the lamp. In the dark, Tommy's voice came from the bed, quiet but alert. Still thinking? Always. He chuckled softly. Well, do it quietly, or the tower will start complaining. But his humour couldn't quite dispel the tension that had crept into the room. Outside, a church bell struck midnight, a hollow sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should. And in the silence that followed, somewhere beyond the guest-house door, a single footstep sounded, slow, deliberate, and then faded away. The first thing that struck Tuppence that morning was the vicarage gate standing open, an event as rare as the vicar's wife missing Sunday service. She and Tommy had been heading toward the tea shop when Mrs. Wilmot's urgent wave from the gate altered their plans entirely. "My dears," she called, breathless with agitation, "there's a gentleman inside, from London. Says he's from the diocesan office. Such a serious man. He's asking the most, well, peculiar questions." "Peculiar questions are our department," Tommy murmured. The man waiting in the vicar's study did not at first glance seem sinister. He was middle-aged, of medium height, well-groomed in the understated way of men accustomed to offices and ledgers. But Tuppence's instincts prickled before he even spoke. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford," he said with an affable nod. "Your names were mentioned as friends of the parish. I'm Mr. Partridge, sent down to review the unfortunate loss of the offertory funds." His tone was polite, yet his eyes darted, measuring, assessing. He carried no papers, no official badge, only a neat leather case that never quite left his grasp. "Delightful of you to come all this way," Tuppence said sweetly, "though surely the matter is hardly a scandal for the diocese." He smiled thinly. "Every missing shilling concerns the church, Mrs. Beresford. The Lord's account books are no less precise than ours." Tommy coughed discreetly to disguise his grin. "Then I hope the Almighty allows for arithmetic errors." Partridge's gaze lingered a moment too long. "You have a keen sense of humour, Mr. Beresford. Perhaps also of curiosity?" "Occupational hazard," said Tuppence lightly. "But you're not here about the child, then? Little Henry Larch?" His expression sharpened. "The Larch boy?" "Oh," she said airily. "He was at the picnic when poor Mr. Miller—" Yes, Partridge interrupted quickly. "A pity, but children pick up nonsense." He was lying. Tuppence saw it in the tightening of his jaw, the faint pulse at his temple. This man already knew about the boy. After a few more minutes of meaningless politeness, Partridge took his leave. The moment he was gone, Mrs. Wilmot sank into a chair. "He asked me if I kept records of all our donations. Can you imagine? I told him naturally that I trust my parishioners." "Trust is admirable," said Tuppence, "but I'd keep your desk locked all the same." Outside, Tommy murmured, "So, our diocesan friend arrived with no documents, no secretary, and a rather unhealthy interest in Henry. What's your verdict?" "Imposter," said Tuppence without hesitation, "and a dangerous one. He knew Albert Larch's name before I said it." That afternoon they chose the tea shop, a small, fussy establishment perfumed with scones and overheard gossip, for their next move. Tuppence's plan was simple. She had sent Mrs. Wilmot to invite Mr. Partridge for refreshment, claiming she would join them later. In reality, it was Tommy and Tuppence who sat in the corner booth, the newspaper held just high enough to conceal their watchful eyes. At 4:30, Partridge entered. He ordered tea and buttered toast, his manner unhurried. 10 minutes later, Tuppence accidentally collided with his table as she passed. "Oh, how clumsy of me. I'm dreadfully sorry." "Not at all," he said, rising to assist her. "Mrs. Beresford again, isn't it?" "The very same," she replied, settling opposite him with a conspiratorial smile. I couldn't help feeling our conversation was left incomplete. Tommy, from his table behind the pillar, listened under the pretence of reading the Times. Partridge stirred his tea. "You take a lively interest in village affairs, Mrs. Beresford." "One likes to understand one's neighbours," she said, "especially when one of them seems to attract so much attention. Poor Albert Larch, such a nervous creature." His spoon stilled. You know him? Only by sight, and by reputation. He worked in intelligence during the war, didn't he? Some sort of code work. That was the bait. Partridge looked up sharply. Where did you hear that? Tuppence feigned confusion. Oh, one hears things. Children talk, Henry most of all. He seems to know his father's past rather well. For the briefest moment his expression betrayed him, surprise tinged with alarm. Children, he said finally, should not repeat everything they hear, especially when they don't understand it. Quite, said Tuppence, but they sometimes repeat things adults would rather forget. He gave a short, humourless laugh. You're an interesting woman, Mrs. Beresford. I hope your husband knows how to keep up with you. He manages. As she rose to leave, he reached for his tea and added, almost carelessly, Do tell him not to climb church towers again. They can be dangerous. Tuppence froze for half a heartbeat before smiling brightly. I'll keep that in mind. When she rejoined Tommy outside, she found him waiting beside the window, jaw set. He knew, he said quietly, about the tower, the satchel, all of it. And Albert's code work, Tuppence added. He slipped that out as though testing me. Then we're not the only ones investigating our poetic young friend. That evening, Meadowbrook seemed unusually still. Even the church bell sounded muted, as though reluctant to disturb the village. Tommy, restless, decided on a short walk. I'll clear my head, he told Tuppence. Keep the kettle warm, and the door locked. He took the long way around, following the hedge path that led behind the churchyard. The moon, a thin silver coin, lay over the graves. It was there, rounding the far corner, that he stopped short. Two figures stood partly concealed by the church wall. One tall, one stooped. The taller man spoke in low, urgent tones. The other nodded, head bowed. A match flared, briefly illuminating their faces. Partridge and Albert Larch. Tommy crouched behind the low boundary stone, every nerve alert. The voices were indistinct, carried away by the faint wind, but he caught fragments. Papers, found, must retrieve, and then Larch's whisper, almost pleading, I've done all I can, don't bring him into it. A sound, perhaps a shifting pebble, betrayed Tommy's presence. Both men turned. He ducked down, heart thudding. When he looked again, they had separated, Larch vanishing toward Mill Road, Partridge melting into the shadows behind the church. Tommy returned to the guest house by the side lane, mind racing. Tuppence was waiting with the kettle, singing softly. Well, he poured himself a cup before answering. Your impostor and our nervous clerk had a moonlit chat in the churchyard. I couldn't hear much, but it's plain Larch is being squeezed for something. Those ledgers, perhaps, she frowned. And Partridge? Still playing official, but he's after something personal, something from Albert's past. Wartime codes, maybe. Then Henry's riddles aren't just child's play, Tuppence said. They're echoes, codes disguised as rhymes. Tommy nodded grimly. And someone wants them silenced. As if to punctuate his words, a knock sounded, sharp, quick as at the outer door. Both froze. Tommy crossed the floor, opened it cautiously, but the step outside was empty. Only the faint scent of tobacco hung in the cool night air. Something gleamed on the ground. He bent and picked it up, a silver cigarette case, heavy and engraved with a crest, crossed swords beneath the initials EMC. He turned it in his palm, studying the design. Military issue, he said slowly, but not Partridge's initials. Tuppence's eyes narrowed. Then we've another player in our game, someone who smokes and listens. Or someone, Tommy said quietly, who's just lost something important. The next morning, the village buzzed with news. The London gentleman was seen leaving the vicarage before dawn, suitcase in hand, a disappearance Marriott later called a feint. Mrs. Wilmot was indignant, the vicar philosophical, and Mrs. Greaves at the guest house muttered that city men never stay once the tea turns local. Tuppence stood by the window, watching the sunlight strike the church tower. He's gone, she said, but not finished. Tommy placed the silver case on the table between them. No, and I'd wager he didn't leave of his own choice. She glanced at him sharply. You think? He shrugged. If our impostor crossed whoever really runs this affair, he may have vanished like the offertory funds, quietly and with no refund. Tuppence exhaled slowly. Then it's time we stopped being spectators. Agreed, Tommy said. Next step, find out what Albert Larch decoded that someone once erased. He pocketed the cigarette case. And if Partridge turns up again, he added dryly, we'll ask him whether he ever climbed a tower he didn't come down from. It was nearly noon when Tuppence spread the papers across the breakfast table like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle no one had wanted to assemble. The room was fragrant with coffee and toast, but her attention was on Henry's notebook, its pages a sprawl of blue ink and uneven scrawl. Tommy, impeccably dressed but somewhat less awake, was buttering his second slice. You've been glaring at that child's poetry for half an hour, and it's yet to confess to a crime. It's not poetry, Tuppence said firmly. It's code. He looked over the rim of his cup. Darling, not every rhyme is a message from the enemy. Not every enemy wears a uniform, she returned, tapping the page. Listen, 3 go walking, 1 comes back. Look for the sign the river lacks. You remember the Larch boy said that at the picnic. Then later, the letter sleeps where the shadows creep. He's repeating patterns. Albert Larch worked in intelligence, decoding enemy transmissions. What if these verses follow a cipher he once used? Tommy whistled. A nursery rhymer's code, clever and plausible. But how would an 8-year-old know it? He wouldn't. His father taught it to him, consciously or not. You've seen how frightened Albert is. Suppose someone forced him to recover something, wartime files perhaps, and the boy overheard too much. Tommy leaned forward, interest stirring. You think Henry's rhymes are his way of passing a warning? Tuppence nodded slowly. The mind protects itself with riddles when plain truth is too frightening. She picked up another page, smoothed it flat. Here, the old mill pond and 3 who sleep beneath. He's pointing somewhere, Tommy. The old mill, we saw it yesterday, half hidden beyond the meadow. Tommy's eyes gleamed. The perfect spot for a Sunday ramble. Bring your charm, she said. We may need it if the ghosts object. The road to the disused mill wound through hedgerows buzzing with bees. The structure itself appeared as they crested the hill, a squat, derelict building of stone and timber, its wheel long stilled and half swallowed by weeds. The mill pond, stagnant and glassy, reflected the broken windows like tired eyes. Picturesque, Tommy observed, if one enjoys decay. Tuppence surveyed it thoughtfully. 3 who sleep beneath, graves perhaps, or something buried. They stepped through the broken doorway, their footsteps echoing hollowly on the warped boards. Dust motes drifted in narrow shafts of sunlight. The scent of damp wood and rust filled the air. Tommy tested a floorboard with his cane. 1 false step and we'll join Henry's trio of sleepers. Then tread lightly. They explored in silence for several minutes. The interior held relics of its working days, a rusted gear, a sagging shelf, a scattering of feathers from the pigeons that had claimed the rafters. It was Tuppence who found the clue. In the corner by the millstone lay a small pile of stones arranged too neatly to be random. Beneath them, half buried in dust, gleamed the edge of metal. She crouched. Tommy, fetch that poker. He did, levering the stones aside. Out came a small tin box, scuffed and pitted, its lid sealed by a strip of wax gone brittle with age. Well, he said softly, our ghosts kept tidy accounts. Tuppence's hands were steady as she broke the seal. Inside lay several folded documents, their edges browned with time. The first bore the faded crest of the War Department. Her heart gave a quick leap. Look, classified memoranda. These are wartime records. Tommy took one, scanning the first lines. Operational cipher schedules, dear me. No wonder someone's nervous. This could ruin reputations if released. She turned over another sheet, half torn, the ink blurred by damp. At the bottom, in a different hand, someone had scribbled, "Return to AL or consequences." Albert Larch, she said quietly. He hid these, and now someone's forcing him to retrieve them. Tommy exhaled. So our imposter, Partridge, wasn't from the diocese at all. He was looking for this, government property left where it shouldn't have been. And the boy overheard. Tuppence's voice softened. He heard things whispered at night, threats, perhaps even a struggle. He turned them into rhymes so he could make sense of them. That's what children do. They play with what frightens them. She sat back on her heels, suddenly weary. All the innocence of a nursery turned into code and fear. Tommy regarded her, sympathy in his eyes. You've always had a weakness for lost children and strayed secrets. I prefer to think of it as conscience, she said briskly, though her tone betrayed a tremor. Come, let's see what else our tin holds. They sorted through the remaining pages. Most were incomprehensible lists of numbers and names, but one fragment caught Tommy's eye. A rough map with the words Bell Tower, signal line M scrawled beside a looping mark. Bell Tower again, he murmured. Our poet's refrain was no coincidence. Albert must have used the church tower as a dead drop during the war. The cache here was part of that system. Tuppence folded the documents carefully. Then whoever blackmailed him knew enough to resurrect the old pattern, perhaps even an old colleague, someone who remembered too well. Tommy looked around the dim interior. We'll take these to Marriott. He'll know how to secure them properly. But as he spoke, a faint sound drifted through the silence, the crunch of gravel outside. Tuppence's head snapped up. Someone's there. Tommy moved swiftly to the window. Through the warped frame he glimpsed movement, a shadow sliding along the wall. Whoever it was wore a hat pulled low and moved with deliberate caution. Too late for casual visitors, he murmured. He gestured for Tuppence to hide the tin. She slipped it behind a beam just as the outer door creaked open. A man's voice called, "Anyone there?" Tommy recognized it instantly. Albert Larch. He relaxed a fraction and stepped forward. "Mr. Larch, over here." The clerk's face when he entered the light was drawn and pale. His eyes darted about the room as if fearing it might collapse. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "If they see you—" "Who exactly?" Tommy asked. Larch swallowed. "They'll think I've told you. Please, you must leave this alone." Tuppence approached gently. "We know about the documents, Albert, and about the threats. Why not let us help?" His composure cracked. "You don't understand. Those files, they were hidden after the war, meant to be destroyed. Names, operations, things that could ruin men. They found out I still knew where they were. I thought if I gave them the papers, they'd leave us alone. But then Henry—" His voice broke. "He heard me talking. He remembers everything. I told him not to repeat it, but he makes rhymes." "Because he's afraid," Tuppence said softly. "He's trying to save you the only way he knows." Larch covered his face with trembling hands. "They said they'd hurt him if I failed. I had no choice." "Then help us now," said Tommy. "Tell us who's behind this." But before the man could answer, a sharp whistle sounded from outside. Brief, warning, unmistakable. Larch flinched. "They're watching," he hissed. "Go. Please, take nothing. Say nothing. I'll fix it." And before either could stop him, he darted through the side door and vanished into the scrub beyond the pond. Tuppence made a move to follow, but Tommy caught her arm. No good chasing. Whoever signalled him might still be out there. They waited in tense silence, listening to the receding rustle of footsteps. Then, from across the water, came the echo of a car engine starting, a single roar, then fading distance. Tuppence let out a slow breath. He's terrified. They've got him completely under control. Tommy retrieved the tin from its hiding place. "Then it's up to us to change the equation." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on the mill pond, its still surface reflecting the dull sky. "It's tragic, isn't it?" she murmured. "All this secrecy, once meant to save lives, now destroying them." Tommy slipped an arm around her shoulders as they walked away. War never ends cleanly. Some battles just change scenery. As they reached the gate, she glanced back. The old mill loomed against the horizon, its wheel frozen mid-turn, a monument to work long abandoned. "Three who sleep beneath," she whispered. "Not graves, but ghosts. Of the past, of guilt, of innocence lost." Tommy gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Then let's see they're laid to rest properly." That evening, back at the guest house, Tuppence sat beside the fire with Henry's notebook open on her knees. The pages fluttered slightly in the draught from the window. She read the latest entry aloud. "When paper burns, the truth turns blue. When fathers lie, the sky does too." Her voice caught. He's watching his father break under something he doesn't understand. Tommy looked up from the tin box, now safely hidden beneath a cushion. "Then we'll make sure the next rhyme he writes is about something ordinary. School, marbles, or cake. Leave the codes to us." For the first time that day, she smiled faintly. "I'd like that. Children should rhyme for joy, not survival." Outside, the wind stirred the church bell faintly, its low note rolling across the village like a sigh, and in its echo lay the promise that whatever secrets had been buried at the mill, the Beresfords were not finished unearthing them yet. The Beresfords arrived at number 4 Mill Road just after dusk. The street lamps had already flickered on, throwing long shadows across the narrow lane. The larch house looked the same as ever, painfully neat, curtains drawn, a faint light showing through the upper window, yet something in its stillness felt unnatural, as though the air itself held its breath. Albert Larch opened the door before they could knock. He looked older by 10 years than when they had last seen him, his face pale and eyes hollow with sleeplessness. "I told you not to come," he said hoarsely. "You're putting us all in danger." "Danger increases in direct proportion to silence," said Tuppence, stepping briskly past him. "We've both had enough of that." Tommy closed the door behind them. "Let's have this out, Mr. Larch. Who's been threatening you, and what exactly is the blue file they want?" Albert's hands trembled as he gestured toward the sitting room. The fire had burned low, throwing nervous light over the modest furnishings. On the table lay a half-packed case, its contents hurriedly chosen: shirts, papers, a shaving kit. "You're running away," Tuppence said quietly. He gave a bitter laugh. "There's nowhere to run. They'd find me. They always do." "Who are they?" Tommy pressed. For a long moment, Albert said nothing. Then, with a strangled sound, he sank into the chair. "It started with a letter. No name, no address, just a demand. Return the blue file. I thought it was some mistake, an old file from the office. But then another came, and then someone watching the house. At night I'd hear the gate creak, footsteps in the lane. They said if I didn't produce it, they'd hurt my wife, or the boy." Tuppence's voice softened. "You never took it, did you?" He looked up sharply, almost pleading. "No. During the war I handled cipher materials, secret reports, double-agent lists, things better buried. The blue file was one of them. It went missing before the end, rumoured to contain names of informants who worked for both sides. If that fell into the wrong hands—" He broke off, shaking his head. "I didn't steal it, but they don't believe me. They think I hid it." Tommy nodded slowly. "And now someone from that old circle is trying to resurrect their leverage." Albert covered his face. "They said I must recover it, that I knew where it was. But I don't. I swear I don't." "Then we'll find out who does," Tuppence said firmly. "Where's Henry?" "Asleep, I hope," he murmured. "He's been restless lately. Nightmares." Tuppence cast a glance toward the stairs. "I'll check on him." She was gone barely a minute before calling softly, "Tommy." He joined her on the landing. The small bed was empty. The covers lay tangled, the window unlatched. A faint draught stirred the curtains. "He's gone," she whispered. Albert appeared behind them, white to the lips. No, he wouldn't. But even as he spoke, Tuppence noticed a small trail on the windowsill. Mud, faint but fresh, and the edge of a torn paper scrap clinging to it. She peeled it off and read aloud. "The man below is calling me." Tommy's voice was grim. The cellar. Rain had begun to fall as they reached the churchyard. It wasn't the stormy kind that dramatists adore, but a steady, patient drizzle, the sort that soaks into the bones and dulls sound to a muted hush. Their footsteps squelched in the damp earth as they followed the narrow path toward the church. A faint light glimmered from a side window, the door to the cellar ajar. "Tommy, I see it." He drew his torch. They descended the worn steps cautiously. The air was thick with the smell of stone and mildew. At the bottom, in the flicker of the torch beam, a small figure crouched beside the far wall. Henry. "Henry!" Tuppence's relief came out half as anger. "What on earth—" The boy looked up slowly. "He asked for me," he whispered. "Who did, darling?" Henry pointed. Only then did they see him, a man slumped against the wall, head bowed, one arm sprawled limply. The light fell across his face and Tuppence gasped. Partridge, or whatever his name truly was, the imposter from London. Tommy moved forward, knelt, and felt for a pulse. He looked up a moment later, his expression grim. Dead, knife wound, low and deep, still fresh. Tuppence swallowed hard. Then whoever did this was here minutes ago. On the floor beside the body lay a scrap of blue-edged paper, singed at one corner. Tommy picked it up with his handkerchief. Faint words remained legible. Directive, Operation Ashford, confidential. "The blue file," he murmured. Or what's left of it. Henry's voice trembled. He said he'd help Daddy. He said he just wanted to make things right. Then he went quiet. Tuppence knelt beside the boy, wrapping her arms around him. You shouldn't have come here, sweetheart. He told me riddles, Henry whispered. The same ones Daddy says when he thinks I'm asleep. I wanted to know what they meant. Tommy straightened, surveying the cellar. There were signs of struggle, a broken lantern, a scuffed heel mark near the door, dark stains on the floor where the water pooled. Whoever killed him came for that file, he said, and when they didn't find it, they burned what they could. He turned to Tuppence. We need Marriott now. Inspector Marriott arrived an hour later, his presence as bracing as cold iron. You two again, he said without surprise. Every time I visit the countryside, I half expect you to pop out of a hedge holding a corpse. Tommy managed a weary smile. We do our bit for local tourism. The inspector crouched beside the body. Knife wound, as you said. Professional. Straight to the heart. No sign of the weapon. He glanced toward Henry, who sat on the steps wrapped in Tuppence's coat. The child found him? Tuppence nodded. He followed the man here. Claims the dead man called for him. Marriott grunted. And you believe that? Tommy shrugged. The boy's riddles have been predicting trouble for days. If he says the man called him, I'm inclined to take it literally. Marriott's eyes narrowed. What do you mean, riddles? So they told him. The coded verses, the threats, the missing documents. As they spoke, the inspector's expression shifted from irritation to wary respect. Well, he said finally, rising, you've landed yourselves in a very pretty mess. Secret files, wartime blackmail, and now a corpse. I'll have my men search the area, but if Larch truly was being blackmailed, we'll need to find him before someone else does. He's terrified, Tuppence said. If he knows Partridge is dead, he may run, or worse. Marriott's voice softened unexpectedly. You've taken to that boy, haven't you? Tuppence met his eyes. Someone has to. Back at the guest house, the Beresfords sat in silence while the clock ticked past midnight. Henry slept fitfully on the sofa, murmuring half-formed lines of verse. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and heavy. Tommy poured 2 small brandies. Well, old thing, he said quietly, it's official now. We've got murder. Tuppence stirred her drink without tasting it. And a child who thinks in ciphers. Do you realize what that means, Tommy? He's been absorbing his father's fear so long it's turned into rhyme. Every secret in that house found its way into his head, and his verses were the only safe way out. He nodded slowly. Then perhaps the truth's in what he's already said. We just have to listen properly. She smiled faintly. For once, a man admitting that listening might help. He raised his glass. Desperation improves humility. A knock sounded at the door, soft but deliberate. Both froze. Tommy crossed the room, opened it cautiously, and exhaled in relief. Marriott stood there, coat dripping. Sorry to disturb, he said, but there's something you should see. He placed a small object on the table, a cigarette stub, crushed and damp. The brand was foreign, expensive. Found it by the cellar steps, he said. Matches the brand smoked by the vicar's wife. Tuppence blinked. Mrs. Wilmot? Marriott shrugged. Could be coincidence, could be a lead. Either way, I'd keep an eye on your church socials. As he turned to go, Tuppence looked down at Henry still sleeping. His small hand twitched as if writing invisible words. She whispered one of his lines under her breath. The one who climbs will never come down. For the first time, the rhyme sounded less like prophecy, and more like a warning still waiting to be understood. Tommy rested a hand on her shoulder. Tomorrow, he said quietly, we start asking who climbed, and who made sure they didn't come down. The morning after the murder dawned with a deceptive calm. Meadowbrook looked unchanged. The baker's boy whistled down the lane, church bells chimed the quarter hour, and Mrs. Greaves was already scrubbing her doorstep with moral fervour. Yet an invisible tension had settled over the village like a faint mist that refused to lift. At the guest-house breakfast table, Tommy and Tuppence studied the day's newspaper. The report was small, a single column tucked beside advertisements for seed catalogues and hair tonic. Unidentified man found dead in Meadowbrook church cellar, believed to be of London origin, the press clearly printing before Marriott released the name. No mention of the knife, Tommy murmured, or the burned papers. Marriott's being discreet. Tuppence buttered her toast with unnecessary precision. Discreetness is wasted on villages. By now, half of Meadowbrook knows there's a corpse under the church and the other half are inventing better versions. He smiled faintly. And which version do we prefer? The one that leads to a living suspect, she said briskly. I don't like mysteries that produce nothing but corpses and riddles. She pushed aside her plate, reaching for Henry's notebook. Its pages had been pored over so many times that the spine was softening. We need to trace who was using our imposter, Partridge or whatever his name was. Tommy leaned back. According to Marriott, his real name was Ernest M. Cowper, dismissed from the War Office for misconduct 3 years ago, the initials matching the cigarette case, EMC. That gives him motive enough to peddle secrets. But who was buying? That, said Tuppence, is what we shall find out before tea. Their first stop was the vicarage, where Mrs. Wilmot received them with red eyes and trembling fingers. She'd taken to wearing black lace scarves, as though mourning added authority. It's all such a nightmare, she sighed, pouring tea. To think of that poor man found beneath our church. The inspector said he once worked for the government. Perhaps he was investigating me. Tuppence took a polite sip. The inspector said nothing of the kind, I'm sure. Mrs. Wilmot leaned forward. Then why did he question the church accounts again? I told him they were perfectly in order. Mr. Larch may be nervous, but he's not dishonest. Tuppence caught the quick glance the woman cast toward the drawer in her escritoire. I'm sure no one doubts it, she said mildly, though it's odd that your missing envelope and the Larch's troubles seem to have occurred so close together. Mrs. Wilmot flushed. Coincidence? Perhaps. Tommy, ever the diplomat, rose and smiled. We won't keep you. You've been through enough excitement. Come along, Tuppence. As they left, he murmured, You were baiting her. Of course, and she nearly bit. By noon, Tuppence had constructed what she called her meadow map on the guest-house writing desk, a web of names and arrows linking villages, events and clues. See, she said, tapping her pencil. Cowper arrives 3 weeks ago. Around the same time, Mrs. Wilmot's church funds vanish, Albert Larch starts receiving threats, and Henry's riddles become darker. Then there are the secret meetings at the bell tower. It's all connected. Tommy peered over her shoulder. That's quite the spider's web, but we still don't know who the spider is. Tuppence frowned. Someone local. Cowper wouldn't know the terrain. He needed help. A messenger. A voice that could move easily between households without raising suspicion. Like the postman? Too obvious. Besides, poor Miller's already dead. She looked up suddenly. Tommy, remember Miss Peveril's remark about Henry? That he spoke in other people's voices? And her story about the man in the cellar? She said it before Cowper's body was found. Tommy straightened. You think she knew? I think she knew something, and bitterness makes for excellent motive, especially the long, simmering kind. Miss Peveril was in her garden, pruning roses with the air of someone who might prefer pruning people. Her house was small but orderly, the curtains perfectly aligned, the gate freshly painted. Good morning, she said without warmth. I suppose you've come to ask about the murder. Everyone else has. Tuppence smiled pleasantly. Actually, I came for advice. I can't decide whether Henry's rhymes are clever or unsettling. He quoted one this morning. The sleeper knows but does not speak. Sounds almost biblical, doesn't it? Miss Peveril froze for a fraction of a second before replying too quickly. Children repeat nonsense. They have no idea what they're saying. Quite, but that phrase, it seems familiar somehow. Perhaps from one of the hymns? No, Miss Peveril said sharply, not a hymn. She turned back to her roses, clipping with unnecessary vigour. Henry's father should keep him quiet. That child has caused enough trouble. Tommy watched her carefully. You sound almost afraid of him. Afraid? She laughed, brittle and short. Of a child? Don't be absurd. But her hands were trembling, and when she dropped her shears, she stooped to retrieve them with visible effort. Tuppence's tone softened. You must have known Albert Larch for years. You were teaching here during the war, weren't you? Miss Peveril's eyes flickered. We all did our part. Indeed. And your fiancé? He was in the service, I believe. The shears stopped mid-air. He never came back, she said quietly. A mistake on a list. The sort of mistake men like Larch were paid to make. The bitterness in her voice was a blade. Tuppence and Tommy exchanged a glance. "Thank you," Tuppence said gently. "You've been most helpful." When they were out of earshot, Tommy murmured, "She's either a red herring or the whole fishmonger's slab." Tuppence didn't answer. Her mind was already turning over the possibilities. They chose the tea shop again as their stage. The plan was simple, a casual chat between husband and wife while observing their suspect. Miss Peveril, punctual as a clock, arrived at 4 precisely. She took her usual table near the window, ordered scones, and opened her notebook, the model of prim respectability. Mrs. Wilmot appeared 5 minutes later, flustered, her gloves mismatched. She made directly for Miss Peveril's table. "Right on cue," murmured Tuppence. They watched discreetly over their teacups. The two women conversed quietly, leaning close. At one point, Miss Peveril slipped something beneath a serviette, a small folded paper, and pushed it across the table. Mrs. Wilmot hesitated, then tucked it into her handbag. Tommy's eyes gleamed. "And curtain down." Tuppence rose, paying the bill with deliberate clumsiness that allowed her to brush past Mrs. Wilmot's chair. In that moment, her hand was quick as a conjurer's. By the time they reached the street, the folded paper rested in her glove. "Well?" Tommy asked once they turned the corner. She unfolded it. Inside was a single line in Miss Peveril's precise script. "Meet me by the tower at dusk. Bring what remains." "Careless," said Tommy, "unless she meant us to find it." "No," said Tuppence slowly. "This wasn't bait, this was instruction. Miss Peveril's orchestrating something, and she thinks Mrs. Wilmot still has part of the file." "Then dusk it is," Tommy said grimly. They waited near the church gate as evening settled, the air thick with the faint tang of rain and cut grass. The mist that had hovered all day began to roll in from the meadows, softening edges, blurring outlines. At 7:30, Mrs. Wilmot arrived, cloaked and nervous. She looked about, clutching her handbag as though it might bite. Moments later, Miss Peveril emerged from the side path. Her posture was stiff, her expression set. "You shouldn't have written," Mrs. Wilmot whispered, glancing around. "It's dangerous." "I wrote because you hesitated," Miss Peveril said coldly. "We can't stop now. Cowper's dead. Someone else will come for the file. We finish what we began." "Finish?" Mrs. Wilmot's voice rose slightly. "You said it was only to frighten him, not this." Miss Peveril seized her wrist. "Lower your voice. We did what had to be done. You'll have your share once it's safe." From their hiding place near the hedge, Tuppence felt Tommy's hand tighten around hers. "Enough," he whispered. "Time to end the show." They stepped out of the shadows. "Ladies," Tuppence said sweetly, "how touching to find friendship blooming in a churchyard." Miss Peveril spun, face draining of colour. "You?" "Us," said Tommy cheerfully. "And Inspector Marriott will be joining the party in a moment. He's just behind the wall." The two women stared, trapped. Mrs. Wilmot broke first, trembling. "I didn't mean harm. I only passed the letters. She said it was to protect Albert, to make him confess." Miss Peveril's composure cracked like glass. "Fool! You've doomed us both." Tuppence stepped forward. "You played messenger for blackmail, Mrs. Wilmot. And you, Miss Peveril, you wanted revenge. The fiancé you lost in the war. The mistakes you blamed on Albert Larch. You saw your chance and took it. Cowper was your weapon, until he became inconvenient." For a moment, Miss Peveril's eyes blazed. "You think I killed him?" "No. I only wanted the truth made public. He—" She broke off as footsteps approached. Marriott emerged from the mist, his lantern beam slicing through the gloom. "Evening, ladies," he said briskly. "I believe this is what you'd call a congregation." Later, when the suspects had been escorted away, Tommy and Tuppence lingered by the gate. The mist curled around the gravestones, pale and silent. Tommy exhaled. So Miss Peveril wasn't the killer after all, only the blackmailer. "No," said Tuppence, "but she set the stage. The true hand behind the knife is still out there." He nodded slowly. "And our boy poet may hold the final verse." She looked up at the bell tower, its shadow rising dark against the sky. "Then we'd better listen carefully." The plan, as Tommy later said, was perfectly straightforward if you ignored the number of ways it could end in disaster. It began that afternoon with Tuppence seated at the guest house writing desk, her pen scratching across a notepaper marked for immediate circulation. The heading would have done credit to a scandal sheet: Local detectives to deliver recovered blue file to Inspector Marriott. Midnight meeting at the old mill. She folded the note neatly. Mrs. Simmons at the shop will do the rest, she said. Her tongue could outpace wireless transmission. Tommy grinned. So we're counting on village gossip as a communications network? My dear, Tuppence replied, it's faster than Morse and infinitely more accurate when it comes to scandal. By tea time, half of Meadowbrook will believe we've solved the case, and by nightfall, the guilty party won't resist confirming it. Let's hope they confirm in person, he said dryly. By evening, the rumour had indeed taken flight. Even the vicar had called to pray that justice be done, while the postmistress had whispered that Tuppence was in league with Scotland Yard. The village trembled with expectation, and the old mill, long silent, once again drew breath in people's imaginations. At 9 o'clock, Tommy checked his watch. Marriott's men are in position, one by the pond, another at the lane gate. He'll wait till we give the signal. Tuppence adjusted her gloves. And we'll play our parts as the unsuspecting detectives. He studied her face in the lamplight. You're pale. I'm furious, she said. If what I suspect is true, an innocent man's been broken, and a child used as a messenger of fear. Tommy touched her shoulder gently. Then let's finish it. The path to the mill was quiet, save for the crunch of their boots on gravel. Mist drifted low over the grass, not dense enough to hide them, but thick enough to give the world a dreamlike unreality. A single lantern glowed faintly through the broken archway. Inside, shadows clung to the beams. The air was damp and cold, the smell of mildew and stagnant water sharp in their noses. Tuppence placed a battered tin box, a decoy for the blue file, on a low stone ledge. Now, she said softly, we wait. Time stretched. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then fell silent. The faint drip of water echoed through the mill's hollow shell. Then, footsteps. A figure appeared in the doorway, hesitant, shoulders hunched. Albert Larch. He looked dreadful, coat damp, eyes hollow, hands trembling as though he'd walked straight out of a nightmare. You shouldn't have done this, he whispered hoarsely. It'll only make things worse. Mr. Larch, said Tommy gently, you came. That's what matters. You've been carrying the weight of this too long. Let us take it from here. But Larch shook his head violently. You don't understand. She said if I told anyone. She? Tuppence echoed. He froze, as if the word itself had betrayed him. From behind them, a second voice cut through the air, calm, cultured, unmistakably feminine. I believe that would be me. They turned. Mrs. Wilmot stood in the doorway, a small pistol gleaming faintly in her gloved hand. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes shining with something cold and final. Tommy's instinct was immediate. He stepped slightly in front of Tuppence. A bit theatrical, don't you think? Guns in a mill are very out of fashion. Don't be flippant, Mr. Beresford, she said evenly. You're far too intelligent to misunderstand your position. Tuppence's voice was quiet but sharp. Then perhaps you'd care to explain why a vicar's wife is pointing a pistol at her congregation. Mrs. Wilmot smiled faintly. Congregation indeed. I married into piety, Mrs. Beresford, but I was born into duty, the kind of duty that requires one to serve one's country, even when it forgets you. Tommy frowned. You served during the war. My brother did, she said, and I served him. He worked in intelligence, decoding and transporting files, including the Blue Series. I smuggled documents for him under the church's protection. We were patriots, until the end, when someone betrayed us. Albert Larch, Tuppence murmured. Mrs. Wilmot's eyes flashed. He made an error that cost lives. My brother's among them. They said it was clerical, accidental, but I knew better. The blue file vanished, and with it the record that would have cleared my brother's name. I meant to recover it, to expose Larch for what he'd done. Albert gave a strangled cry. I didn't betray him. I tried to protect him. The file was marked for destruction. I thought it safer burned. Liar, she hissed. You buried your guilt in paperwork and prayer. I found your weakness long ago, your precious family, your son with his clever verses. You told him stories, didn't you, about codes and secrets. You made him my tool. Tuppence stepped forward slightly. So the riddles, you twisted them, fed him phrases to repeat to draw Albert out. Mrs. Wilmot's voice trembled now. He only repeated what was true, And Cowper. Your brother's accomplice, said Tommy softly. She nodded. After the war, he tried to help me find the file. We nearly succeeded, until you interfered. He was weak, sentimental. He wanted to end it. I couldn't let him. I never meant... The pistol wavered slightly. Albert spoke brokenly. He came to me that night. He begged me to forgive you both. Said he'd tell the police everything. Mrs. Wilmot's control cracked. He betrayed me too, she cried, and her hand jerked upward. Tuppence moved without thinking. She struck the lantern hanging from the beam beside her. It swung wildly, then fell, bursting against the stones. The flame whooshed to life, spilling light and smoke. Tommy lunged forward, seizing Albert and dragging him aside. Mrs. Wilmot fired, once, the shot ringing through the mill, shattering glass. The flame leapt higher, feeding on dry straw and oil residue. Shadows convulsed on the walls. Tuppence grabbed the pistol arm, twisting hard. "Don't make it worse," she shouted. For a moment they struggled, the two women locked in a fierce, graceless dance. The gun clattered to the floor. Mrs. Wilmot stumbled back, staring as the fire flared. Tommy flung his coat over the nearest flame, stamping hard. "Marriott!" he bellowed toward the door. Almost instantly the inspector and two constables appeared, bursting through the smoke. Marriott's expression was grim. "Good Lord, what have you done now?" "Just catching a murderer," Tommy coughed, "with a side order of arson." The constables seized Mrs. Wilmot as she sagged against the wall, the fight draining out of her. "I wanted justice," she whispered. "That's all." Marriott's tone was flat. "You'll have it, but not the kind you imagined." An hour later, the fire was doused. The mill smouldered, blackened but still standing. The air smelled of wet ash and scorched oil. Tuppence sat on an upturned crate, brushing soot from her skirt. "Well," she said faintly, "next time we spread a rumour, let's ensure it doesn't include fire hazards." Tommy, equally grimy, managed a grin. "You were brilliant as usual. Quick thinking with that lantern." "I nearly set us all ablaze." "True, but the effect was spectacular. You should consider stage work." Marriott approached, notebook in hand. The woman's confessed enough to hang herself twice, said she manipulated the boy to lure his father into confessing, and used Cowper to recover the rest of the documents. When he hesitated, she panicked. Tuppence's eyes softened. "And Henry?" "He's safe with a neighbour," Marriott said. "Doesn't understand half of it, thank heaven." Albert Larch, sitting a few yards away under guard, lifted his head weakly. "Will they believe I didn't steal it?" "They will now," said Tommy quietly. "And when the inquiry's done, perhaps they'll remember the difference between guilt and grief." Larch gave a small, broken nod. By the time they returned to the guest house, dawn was creeping over the horizon, soft gold bleeding through the mist. The air was clean again, smelling of damp earth and the faint sweetness of lilac. Tuppence leaned against the garden gate, breathing deeply. "You know, Tommy," she said at last, "I can't decide whether we've solved a mystery or closed a wound." "Both," he said, "but I suspect neither will stay closed for long." She smiled faintly. "You're becoming philosophical in your old age." "I blame the company. You make contemplation contagious." From the road came the distant sound of a milk cart, the ordinary rhythm of life resuming. Tuppence turned toward the house. "Come in, darling. We've earned breakfast." He followed, pausing at the threshold to glance back once more at the valley, the church spire, the faint wisp of smoke from the mill, the awakening village that had witnessed betrayal and redemption in a single night. As he closed the door, the sound of a child's voice drifted faintly from the garden next door. Henry, reciting to himself as he played with a stick in the soil. 3 go walking, 1 comes back, but truth walks on the hidden track. Tuppence paused, listening. Tommy smiled. "New verse?" "Perhaps," she said softly, "or maybe the last line of this one." They exchanged a quiet look, partners in mystery, in danger, in life, and the house filled with the warmth of a morning unspoiled by secrets. The first rays of dawn touched Meadowbrook like cautious fingers, gilding the wet grass and the blackened timbers of the old mill. Smoke rose in thin threads from the smouldering ruin, curling lazily into a sky too gentle for what the night had seen. Inspector Marriott stood by the water's edge, notebook in hand, his coat collar turned up against the lingering chill. Behind him, constables moved through the wreckage, their boots crunching over damp ash and broken wood. He glanced toward the group by the cart track. Tommy Beresford, his sleeve torn and soot-streaked. Tuppence beside him, composed but pale. Albert Larch sitting on a crate with his arm bandaged, and Mrs. Wilmot, wrapped in a constable's coat, her face hidden in her hands. "Well," Marriott said at last, "if I hadn't seen it myself, I'd call it melodrama. Fires, confessions, and a lady with a pistol. You two certainly know how to tidy up a case." Tommy managed a crooked smile. "We try to keep things interesting." Tuppence shook her head. "It isn't melodrama, Inspector. It's what happens when secrets are left to rot." Marriott closed his notebook with a snap. "Secrets, yes. We've recovered what's left of your blue file, Mr. Larch. Most of it's nothing but half-burned gibberish. Codes, initials, obsolete operations. Useless now." Albert looked up weakly. "So all that suffering, for nothing." "For paranoia," Marriott corrected. "The kind that doesn't die when wars end." Tuppence glanced at the small figure standing a few yards away. Henry, clutching a wool blanket far too large for him. His eyes were shadowed, not from fear but from knowing too much. She crouched beside him. "It's over, Henry. You and your mother will rest now. No more riddles." He looked at her solemnly. "But riddles tell the truth, don't they?" Tuppence smiled faintly. "Sometimes, but the best truths are quiet ones. They don't need rhymes to hide in." Henry frowned, considering this, then nodded as though granting her the point. Later that morning, the Beresfords stood outside the vicarage, watching as the police car carried Mrs. Wilmot away. The lane was already filling with curious villagers pretending to be out for early errands. Miss Peveril, wrapped in her shawl, stood stiffly by her gate, her expression unreadable. "She'll stand trial," Tommy said quietly. "Marriott says her confession leaves little doubt." "Yes," Tuppence murmured. But in her mind she was avenging her brother, not committing a crime. It's a dangerous sort of grief, the kind that dresses itself as justice. Tommy nodded. "And poor Larch, cleared at last, though he'll hardly feel vindicated." They started down the lane. The morning sun glinted on the puddles, turning them to mirrors. Henry walked a few steps ahead, hopping from one dry stone to another, his blanket trailing behind like a small banner. "Do you think he'll forget?" Tommy asked. Tuppence's gaze softened. "Children forget differently from us. They turn fear into play, sorrow into songs. Some day he'll rhyme about clouds and bells, and no one will know what it once meant." He gave her a sidelong glance. "You sound almost wistful." "Perhaps I am. We spend our lives untangling riddles, Tommy, and sometimes I wonder if we ever solve the right ones." By midday, the village had already begun to stitch its composure back together. The baker's boy delivered loaves as though corpses in church cellars were a weekly occurrence. Miss Simmons at the shop had a new headline of her own making: "Secret agents in our midst, London detectives save child." Tommy and Tuppence sat in the tea shop where so much of the intrigue had begun. The air smelled of scones and reprieve. Tuppence stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Do you realize, Tommy, that every clue in this case was hiding in plain sight? A boy's rhyme, a ribbon, a bell tower, nothing sinister, until someone gave it meaning." "That's life, darling," he said, leaning back. "Everything's innocent until someone explains it." She smiled at that. "Inspector Marriott said something similar. That meaning's the most dangerous weapon. Once people start believing they know what something stands for, they'll kill to defend it." Tommy nodded slowly. "And here we are, still trying to make sense of nonsense." She reached across the table, touching his hand lightly. "Maybe that's our curse, or our gift." That afternoon, they went to the Larch house one last time. Mrs. Larch, frail but recovering, was seated by the window with a cup of broth. The air smelled of soap and lavender, the first honest scents the house had held in weeks. Tuppence sat beside her. "You and Henry need rest. The seaside will do wonders. Sunshine, sand, a bit of peace." Mrs. Larch's eyes filled with tears. "After all this, do you think we can ever have peace?" Tuppence smiled gently. "Peace isn't forgetting, my dear. It's remembering without fear." Henry appeared in the doorway, holding something behind his back. "I made a new rhyme," he announced. "Let's hear it," Tommy said. Henry took a deep breath. "The bell has rung, the game is done, the light is brighter than the sun. 3 went walking, 1 came home, and truth was never left alone. He looked at them expectantly. Tuppence applauded softly. That's a very good rhyme. What does it mean? Henry asked. Tommy winked. You tell us. You're the poet. The boy frowned, then grinned. It means we can go to the seaside now. Tuppence laughed. Exactly so. The train to the coast left just after noon the following day. The platform smelled of coal smoke and oranges, and the air carried the faint promise of salt. Henry chattered about sandcastles. Mrs. Larch clutched her small case, still nervous of travel. Tommy stowed their luggage in the compartment, then leaned against the doorframe as Tuppence settled the family into their seats. Look at us, he said with mock solemnity. Transporting victims to the sea. There's a slogan in that somewhere. Something patriotic, perhaps, she teased. Beresford and Comity, restoring Britain's mental equilibrium since 1910. He laughed. That's better than half the firms in Whitehall. The whistle blew. As the train began to move, Tuppence watched the countryside slide past. Hedgerows, meadows, the faint line of the church spire receding into distance. She sighed softly. Do you think the truth really matters anymore, Tommy? Those files, they were meant to protect, then to destroy, and now they're just ash. Maybe truth only survives when it's disguised, spoken like nonsense. He tilted his head, studying her. That's rather profound for this hour of the morning. Don't be flippant. I'm not. I'm just considering the idea that you and that boy might be right. Perhaps the only way truth endures is through riddles, because no one tries to censor what they don't understand. Tuppence smiled faintly. Then let's hope we never understand too much. He raised an eyebrow. Careful, darling, that almost sounds like a resolution. The rhythm of the train filled the silence between them, steady, reassuring. Henry pressed his face to the window, pointing at the distant glitter of the sea. There it is, he cried. Tuppence leaned over to see, her smile widening. Yes, the end of Riddles, for now. Tommy chuckled. For now. I've said that before, you know. Every time we promise ourselves a quiet holiday, and every time someone hides a body under the breakfast table, she finished. Precisely. They shared a laugh that came easily at last, the sound of two people who had walked through darkness and found the sun waiting on the other side. As the train curved toward the coast, the fields gave way to cliffs and glittering water. Tuppence closed her eyes, the hum of the wheels like a lullaby. Somewhere behind them lay a village that would, in time, forget the details, but keep the legend. The child who spoke in riddles, the detectives who listened, and the truth that sounded like nonsense but saved lives all the same. Tommy reached across the seat and took her hand. Promise me one thing, he said. What's that? No riddles on holiday. She opened one eye. No promises, darling. He groaned good-naturedly. I thought as much. The sea shone ahead, silver and alive, and the train steamed onward into sunlight, mystery dissolving into the bright, forgiving day.